Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Priyanka Neela Krishnan show with me, Priyanka Neela Krishnan. This is Enterprise Security Series, episode 42, and today's topic ransomware is the last step and not the first. This is the show, the Enterprise Security Show, for security and business leaders who want to understand risk before it becomes a headline. As always, my note up front, this is an independent commentary by my own views, not tied to any employer, product, or vendor. And today, we are talking about ransomware, but not the part everyone focuses on, not the locked screens and the ransom note, because by then the story is already over. We are talking about the weeks before the quiet prelude that almost every victim missed. Ransomware is the last step of an attack, not the first. And once you understand that, your entire response posture shifts from surviving the invoice to reading the warning signs. Over the next 15 minutes, I'll walk you through the timeline attackers actually follow and the single signal that gives you roughly 90 days of runway if you know to look for it. Let us get into it. The ransom note feels like the beginning of the crisis, but it is the end of one. By the time your screen's locked, the attacker has usually been living in your environment for weeks or months, quietly stealing data, mapping access, and choosing the moment. The good news buried in that bad news is this: the warning signs are measurable and they show up long before the ransom note. This episode is about reading them. I am Priyanka Neela Krishnan, and let us talk about what happens before ransomware. Let me reframe ransomware from the first sentence because most organizations respond to it at exactly the wrong moment. The ransom note is not the attack. The ransom note is the invoice. It arrives at the end. By the time you see it, the real work is already done. The attacker got in weeks or months earlier, usually through a stolen credential or an unpatched flaw, exactly the things we covered in the last few episodes. Then they moved quietly. They mapped your environment, escalated their access, and here is the part that changed the game. They stole your data before they ever encrypted anything. Modern ransomware is a double extortion. They lock your systems and they threaten to leak what they took. So the encryption is theater at the end of a long, quiet operation. If you only start responding when the screens go dark, you're showing up to a crime scene that went cold a month ago. Let me explain why the invoice framing changes your whole response posture. If you believe the attack is the encryption, you stand up incident response when the screens lock, which is the moment the attacker has finished their work and holds all the leverage. If you understand the encryption is the last step, you start looking much earlier at the quiet signals that precede it. Modern ransomware is double extortion. They steal your data first, then encrypt. So even flawless backups do not save you from the threat to leak what they took. That means recovery alone is not a strategy anymore. The data was already gone before the note appeared. Your leverage was upstream in the weeks you did not know you were being robbed. So, here is the timeline as most organizations experience it versus how it actually runs. What you see is day zero, the note. Systems locked, a countdown timer, a demand in cryptocurrency. It feels sudden and total, like the attack was a single event. What actually happened is on the right. Months earlier, a credential leaked or an info stealer landed on a device. That foothold got used. Access quietly expanded, often through the overprivileged and unmonitored identities we have been talking about all throughout the series. Data was exfiltrated slowly enough to avoid attention. Every one of those steps left a trace, and every one of them was detectable. If the organization had been governing access and watching how its data moved. The tragedy of most ransomware is not that it was sophisticated, it is that the signal was there for months and nobody was reading it. Let me walk the right hand timeline in more detail, a little bit more, because every step on it was a missed chance. It usually opens with a info stealer on a device or a credential bought from a broker. The same leaked credentials we keep coming back to in the series, right? That same ones. That foothold gets used to move quietly, escalating through overprivileged, unmonitored identities we covered a couple episodes ago. Then comes slow exfiltration, paced to avoid tripping alarms. Every one of those actions left a trace, and everyone was detectable by an organization that governed its access and watched how its data moved. The hard truth of most ransomware is not that the attacker was a genius. It is that the signal sat in the environment for weeks and no one was positioned to read it. This is the number I want you to remember from this episode. 73% of ransomware victims had an infostealer infection or a credential leak in the year before their ransomware attack. Nearly 3 in 4 and half of those exposures happened within 95 days of the attack. Think about what that means. What used to look like background noise, a credential showing up in a leak, a device with an infostealer, is actually a reliable early warning signal for ransomware. This finding, drawn from the Verizon 2026 DBIR data, changes the job. It means treating infostealer exposure and leaked credentials not as routine cleanup, but as a countdown clock. When a corporate credential shows up in a leak, you're very possibly looking at the opening move of a ransomware operation, and you may have around 3 months to act. That is not a lot of time, but it is not zero. It is a warning you can read. Let me make 73% more actionable because it reframes routine work as early warning. For years, a credential showing up in a leak was a cleanup ticket. Reset the password, close it out, and move on. This finding says that same event is 3/4 of the time the opening move of a ransomware operation, and you may have roughly 90 days before it escalates. There is not a lot of runway, but it is not zero. And it is far more than you get if you wait for the note. Sophos found separately that 67% of ransomware attacks began with identity compromise. So the countdown is identity shaped and it is readable. The organizations that beat ransomware learned to treat a leaked credential like a smoke alarm and not as a core. 2 more numbers to size the problem and for once to end on something hopeful. First, the scale. Ransomware is now present in 48% of breaches, nearly half. It is not a niche threat for a few unlucky industries. It is a default outcome of a successful intrusion. But here is a shift in leverage and it matters. A majority of victims, 64%, refuse to pay the ransom, and median ransom payments have been falling. Why? Because organizations got more resilient, better backups, better recovery, and a growing recognition that paying does not guarantee anything and funds the next attack. So the picture is not all dark. Attackers are trying ransomware more and getting paid less because defenders learn to survive the encryption, which points directly at where the leverage is. Not in paying, in detecting early and recovering well. Let me hold on the hopeful number for a second because it points at real leverage. A majority of victims now refuse to pay, and median payments are falling, and that did not happen by accident. It happened because organizations invested in resilience, in backups, they actually tested, in recovery, they had rehearsed, and in a growing recognition that paying funds the next attack and guarantees nothing. So the attacker's core business model is getting less profitable, not because we stopped the intrusions, but because we got better at surviving them. That tells you exactly where your investment pays off, not in negotiation and not in hoping to block every intrusion, but in detecting the polluted early and recovering so completely that the ransom demand becomes a bad joke instead of a crisis. So here is a reframe. Most ransomware preparation focuses on the aftermath. Backups, recovery runbooks, incident response retainers. All essential, keep doing it. But if that is your whole strategy, you're preparing to survive the invoice and ignoring the 90 days before it. The leverage is upstream. Start treating leaked credentials and info stealer detections as the highest priority signals in your environment. Because 73% of the time, that is what the beginning of ransomware looks like. When a credential leaks, do not just reset the password and close the ticket. Assume it may be an opening move, investigate what that identity can reach, watch for the quiet access expansion and data movement that follow, and act inside the roughly 90-day window the data gives you. Hunt the prelude, and you can end the story before the note is ever written. Trust me, and let me make the upstream reframe concrete. Because most ransomware budgets are pointed at the wrong end. Backups, runbooks, and response retainers are essential, and you should keep every one. But if that is your entire strategy, then you're preparing to survive the invoice while ignoring the 90 days before it, which is where you actually had power. Shift some of that attention upstream. When a credential leaks, do not just rotate it and close the ticket. Assume it may be an opening move, investigate what that identity can reach, and watch for the quiet access expansion and data movement that follow. You are hunting the prelude and get good at that, and you end the story before the note is ever written, which is the only version of this where you win outright. 3 moves. First, treat leaked credentials as alarms and not cores. Monitor for your organization's credentials appearing in InfoStealer logs and breach dumps. And when one shows up, respond as though it is the opening move of an attack, because nearly 3/4 of the time, that is exactly what it is. Second, watch the data, not just the endpoint. The quiet exfiltration that precedes encryption is your best chance to catch it while you can still stop it. Instrument for unusual access to and movement of sensitive data, which is only possible if you have governed the data in the first place. And third, Recover so well that paying is pointless. Test your restoration until you genuinely know you can come back without the attacker. That resilience is what turned the tide this year. And it is what makes the ransom note a nuisance instead of a catastrophe. On watching the data rather than the endpoint, understand why it is your best interception point. The exfiltration that precedes encryption is the one and only step the attacker cannot skip in a double extortion model, and it is visible if and only if you have governed your data well enough to know what normal access looks like, anomaly detection. And that is the payoff of everything in the series converging. And on recovery, be honest with yourselves in testing. A backup you have never restored under pressure is a hope and not a control. The organizations that flip the payment statistics are the ones that practiced coming back without the attacker until they knew, not hope, that they could. That certainty is what removes the attacker's leverage entirely. So, to close, by the time you read the ransom note, the story is already written, the credential leaked, the access expanded, the data left. The organizations that beat ransomware are the ones with the best negotiators. They are not. They are the ones who learn to read the chapters that come before the note and who govern their access and data well enough to keep the ending small. In the next episode, we zoom all the way out to the language your board actually speaks, not vectors and vulnerabilities, dollars. That is one number every board remembers, and I'm going to show you how to use it. I am Priyanka Neela Krishnan, and thank you very much for watching. So the through line for this one is a shift in when you engage. By the time you read the note, the credential leaked, the access sprawled, and the data left. The story is written. The organizations that beat ransomware are not the ones with the best crisis negotiators. They are the ones who learn to read the chapters before the note and who govern their access and data well enough to keep the endings small even when they miss the early signs. Read the prelude or pay the invoice. Those are increasingly the two options, and only one of them is in your control. This is the source slide from where I gathered some of the information. Alright, so this was the episode 42. The one thing to remember from this specific episode is by the time you read the ransom note, the credential leaked, the access sprawled, and the data already left. The organizations that beat ransomware are not the ones with the best negotiators. They are the ones who learn to read the chapters before the note. Treat a leaked credential like a smoke alarm. Watch how your data moves. Test your recovery until you know, not hope, that you can come back. If this was useful, please do subscribe and share it with your incident response lead. Tell me in the comments whether your last backup restore was a real test or a checkbox. I am Priyanka Neela Krishnan, and this has been my independent commentary on enterprise data security, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe, stay secure. Bye everybody.